In February 2009, in Ontario, Canada, when two depraved, twisted minds crossed one another's paths, they would embark on a plan of true evil. Their cruel, sick desires led to one of the most horrific crimes in Canadian history. This case ignited fury and outrage across the nation and demand for justice reform. Who were these sick monsters, and who was the innocent victim who would become their unfortunate target? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. I am your host, Alita Caldwell. In this podcast, I discuss cases of murder from around the world and throughout history, attempting to unravel the layers of darkness that hell make humans into monsters. If you enjoy this show, please make sure you are following or subscribed on your listening platform of choice. Consider leaving a rating on Apple or Spotify, or leave a review. Thank you so much for listening. Your support and your feedback makes more of a difference than you know. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. This is a special warning for those of you who are extra sensitive to crimes committed against children. Woodstock, Ontario is a small town with around 46,700 residents, as recorded in its most recent census in 2021. The city is known as the dairy capital of Canada and promotes itself as the friendly city. In the year this tragedy occurred, the community was known for being relatively safe, quiet, and very family-oriented. It didn't have many incidents of violent crime, and in fact, crime had declined in this area during this time. However, the town did face a growing community of drug users, in particular opioid users, and the problems associated with this ongoing epidemic. On Wednesday, April 8th, 2009, a little after 4 p.m., Rodney Stafford called his ex-wife, Tara McDonald, to let her know he was running a little behind schedule to pick up their daughter, Victoria. They had been divorced since she was 2, and Victoria, along with her older brother Darren, lived with and spent most of their time with her mother Tara and their stepfather James. At the time, Tara said not to worry because Victoria hadn't returned from school yet. But then she found it odd that Victoria wasn't back yet when school was out at 3:30 p.m. It was the first time Victoria was walking back home from school on her own without her older brother. So she and her mother left the house and drove over to her school, Oliver Stevens. While they were driving around, they stopped to speak to a patrol officer parked in front of the school. He encouraged them to report her missing. They didn't want to jump to conclusions and assume the worst. So they first contacted all of her classmates and their parents. But no one knew where the little girl was. As the sun began to set, Tara felt something was off, and she reached out to Rodney to tell him that their daughter still hadn't returned home. Now it was 6 p.m. Rodney and his mother immediately began searching for Victoria, and she was reported missing to the police. Shortly after, Staff Sergeant Paul James Hess was informed about the little girl who went missing while walking back from school. Approximately 99% of their missing kids' cases ended up being safely found. But something felt different about this case to him and the other officers involved. His gut told him that something was terribly wrong. It was already a little after 6 p.m., and there was no time to waste. Sergeant Hess immediately launched a search party for the missing 8-year-old girl, pulling in both uniformed and plainclothes officers to assist. Since the local police only handle crime and traffic enforcement within city limits, the Ontario Provincial Police, who patrol the highways, waterways, and unincorporated areas of the larger Ontario region, were immediately contacted and brought in for assistance. They conducted a massive search across neighborhoods, the wetlands, anywhere and everywhere the child could possibly be. But there was no sign of Victoria Stafford. It would later be recorded as the largest search in the history of the Ontario Provincial Police, and one of the biggest in all of Canada. However, an Amber Alert was never issued. Law enforcement was harshly criticized for this, but it wasn't due to their neglect or inaction. Multiple times, officers of the Ontario Provincial Police, also known as the OPP, contacted the Amber Alert Service, but they were told the investigation didn't meet the strict, narrow parameters to issue the alert. For an Amber Alert to be issued, 3 specific requirements had to be met. First, a child under 18 had been abducted. Secondly, the child was in danger of serious harm. And third, there was enough descriptive information about the child and or the abductor so the alert was helpful to the public. Since there was no proof that Victoria Stafford was forcibly taken, the officer's hands, so to speak, were tied. To prevent confusion with similarly named females that are at the forefront of this case, I will be referring to her as Victoria throughout this episode. Victoria Elizabeth Marie Tori Stafford, affectionately called Tori, was born on July 15, 2000. When she went missing, she stood 4 foot 5 inches tall, weighed 62 pounds, and had short blonde hair and blue eyes. When she was last seen, she was wearing a green shirt, a denim skirt, and a black Hannah Montana jacket. When her mother, Terri McDonald, saw the official missing child poster that was created for her own daughter, the reality that she had vanished sank in. It was a surreal nightmare for any parent to experience. When the police interviewed teachers at Victoria's school, Oliver Stevens, they learned that she had left about 1 minute after the rest of the students that day. The dismissal bell had rang at 3:25, but she had forgotten her mom's butterfly earrings inside the class, so she ran back to get them. The next day, officers discovered grainy security footage of Victoria Stafford's last known sighting. At 3:32 p.m., a surveillance camera from a local high school captured the little girl and an unidentified woman walking away from Oliver Stevens. From what could be seen, the female appeared to be young, approximately between 19 and 25 years old, stood 5'2", and weighed around 125 pounds. She wore a white, puffy coat and had a black ponytail. The camera showed the woman luring the girl away, but she didn't appear to be taken by any force. Victoria showed no signs of fear or resistance. She was willingly walking along, even skipping beside the woman, briefly holding her hand. Victoria's father, Rodney, was terrified when he saw the footage of this strange woman and his little girl, who, by all looks, must have known the older female enough to walk away with her. Victoria's paternal grandparents offered a $10,000 reward for her return. After the police released the footage of the woman and the missing child, appealing to the public for help in identifying the unknown female seen on camera, more than 900 tips flooded in. To help with the overwhelming task of investigating each possible lead, several police departments in the Ontario area assisted. Multiple sources would lead the police to the face and name behind the mysterious young woman. She was identified as an 18-year-old named Terri-Lynne McClintic. On April 12th, the young woman was brought into custody on an outstanding arrest warrant. Investigators showed her the surveillance footage of Victoria Stafford's abduction. Terri-Lynne McClintic laughed at the video and told the police there was no way in hell that was her. She was transferred to the Nest Detention Center in London, Ontario for the outstanding charges, while the police continued their investigation. The same night Terri-Lynne McClintic was arrested, more than 1,000 community members came to a vigil for Victoria Stafford. Her mother, Terri McDonald, made an emotional plea, telling the attendants and the press, anywhere, any way that she can get back to us, if she can call or get away, find a way to come home. The next day, the police ended the ground search for Victoria Stafford after failing to find any evidence. However, Constable Maitland, who believed the girl was alive and would be found, told the community, "I think the feeling among police is, yes, she is, and I'm happy to report that feeling." In response, her mother, Terri McDonald, addressed this shared belief with the police that Victoria is still alive, saying, "I'm her mother. I know her better than anyone else on the planet." When little Victoria Stafford went missing after school, the parents of her classmates were in a panic, gripped with fear that the same could happen to their children. They didn't return to school until the 13th. The parents of her classmates did whatever was needed to help assist the police in the investigation, submitting a polygraph test that same weekend of the girl's disappearance. The community at large was highly invested in locating the little girl, and across all of Canada, whatever happened to 8-year-old Victoria Stafford became the top news story. On April 15th, 2009, America's Most Wanted featured the missing little girl in their show. 2 days later, the Ontario Provincial Police formally classified the case as an abduction, and the ground search was resumed. Due to the preliminary investigation, over 2,500 homes were canvassed in the town of Woodstock alone. That didn't include the surrounding communities. Wiretaps were placed on known criminals. Sex offenders were interviewed with their alibis vetted, and multiple discussions were had with informants. Within 1 week after the OPP officially took over the case, more than 100 detectives were actively working on locating Victoria Stafford. In the initial months following Victoria Stafford's disappearance, her parents became the center of the media and therefore the investigation. Specifically, her mother, Terri McDonald, became the target of rumors and macabre speculation. On April 21st, a composite sketch of the woman in the white coat walking away with the child was released to the public. Her father, Ronnie Stafford, said that he didn't know the woman personally, but she looked familiar. Victoria's mother, Terri McDonald, initially said she didn't know her, but Terri-Lynne McClintic wasn't a stranger to either her or her husband. Terri McDonald was a recovering drug addict who was acquainted with Terri-Lynne McClintic through her mother, who sold her OxyContin pills on a few occasions. The two had even discussed breeding their Shih Tzu dogs. According to some sources, Terri admitted to the police that she had relapsed and taken some pills on the day Victoria was taken. Her substance abuse and lack of emotion she showed in the press painted her in a less empathetic light, and gossip and suspicions followed her every move. Victoria's mother had refused to assist with the search party to find her daughter, and received a lot of grief from the community and online for her lack of action. She claimed that, of course, it wasn't because she didn't want to, but she couldn't handle the thought of finding her child dead. However, she was heavily involved in a Facebook group, Sad for Her Daughter, which already had 10,000 members. Her husband and Victoria's stepfather, James Gores, was a little bit more open with the media. He invited them into their home and showed them the many dolls and teddy bears that members of the community had donated for Victoria when she returned home safe. Victoria's father, Ronnie Stafford, heavily participated in the searches and did absolutely everything he could to help locate his daughter, including going to social media to call out whoever took her. In one post he wrote, "If by chance the persons responsible for the disappearance of Victoria are reading this, I hope you are scared, nervous, or whatever your sick minds are feeling right now, but know this, Daddy and the world are coming for Victoria." Terri and Rodney couldn't hide their adverse feelings toward each other, and it escalated during one of their daily media conferences. Rodney Stafford called Victoria's mother out on camera, saying she was showing no support, no worry, no emotion for their missing daughter. Terri replied that it was easy for him to cry now because he felt guilty for not being around, asking him, "Where have you been the last 9 years?" It was difficult not to be skeptical, even suspicious of the mother, who never cried on camera. Some people even believed it was Terri herself in the video. The female in the video appeared to be around 5'2", while Terri was much taller than that, so it didn't make any logical sense. But that didn't stop the rumors or prevent vicious tales from spreading. She addressed the gossip in a news conference, stating that she was tired of being viewed as a suspect in her daughter's disappearance, and she wanted everyone to just focus on Tori. Although Victoria's father, Ronnie Stafford, had been primarily absent in both of his children's lives, he wasn't portrayed or perceived by his community in the same negative way her mother, Terri McDonald, was. Not only did community members whisper when she walked by and talked trash about her, but she had become the police's prime suspect. Or at least that's what she believed. Based on what they put her through, it was difficult to deny. According to Terri McDonald, during an interview with Crime Beat, she said that the police gave her a 1-800 number to share with the public that would lead to reward for information as to who had Victoria. She believed they thought she would just call the number and everything would fall into place. Under the premise that she was involved in her daughter's abduction, she would receive the reward money and then get her daughter back. Investigators even went so far to present her with a Ziploc bag of blonde hair, the same color as her daughter's. Terri McDonald willingly submitted to a lie detector test, but the suspicions and doubts still lingered. Officers screamed at her, interrogated her, and pushed her to the brink. Terri McDonald had admitted that same night Victoria went missing that she was a recovering drug addict to the police. She swore that except for one relapse over a year earlier, she had been clean, but that ended up not being the truth. Some people began thinking that Victoria may have been taken as part of a drug debt. Her stepfather, James Gores, had been arrested in 2000 for drug trafficking, so some wondered whether the couple was still involved in drug dealing, which had led to Victoria being taken. But both swore there were no issues, and they had no drug connection at all anymore. Investigators thoroughly looked into the possibility of this connection, but no evidence ever surfaced, indicating it was a factor. Meanwhile, investigators began to look more closely at individuals in Terri-Lynne McClintic's circle. On May 8th and May 12th, she received the same visitor. He was a 28-year-old man named Michael Rafferty. The two warmly greeted one another, chit-chatted, and hugged. A few days later, when interviewed by police and asked about their relationship, Michael Rafferty claimed that they were only friends, almost laughing off the idea that he was her boyfriend. It was learned that the two had met at a pizza shop a few months earlier. According to Terri-Lynne McClintic's mother, he and Terri-Lynne had quickly become infatuated with one another. Detectives gathered evidence of their most recent communications. Between April 19th and May 15th, about 30 calls were made between Michael Rafferty's BlackBerry and the Zenest Detention Center, where Terri-Lynne was being held. On May 19th, 2009, Terri-Lynne McClintic was brought into a formal interview with homicide investigators. She initially continued to deny being involved with the child's disappearance, but then she suddenly broke down into tears and confessed everything to the police. Terri-Lynne described to Detective Sergeant Smythe how she and Michael Rafferty had talked previously about it before, saying to one another, "Oh, would you ever kidnap someone?" And how they went through a whole thing where they were egging each other on about it, saying, "Oh, you're just talk. You never do it. You're just talk. You're going to do that today? You're going to do that today?" Then, Terri-Lynne McClintic told police how one day Michael Rafferty had suggested they abduct a young female because she would be so easy to manipulate. According to the confession provided by Terri-Lynne McClintic, the following sequence of events occurred on April 8th. Around 3:30 p.m., the couple drove to Oliver Stevens School. Terri-Lynne McClintic left Michael's vehicle, which was parked around the corner in the parking lot of a nursing home. Victoria was the first young female she spotted. She swore to the police that she would never have lured her away if she had known what was going to happen to her. Terri-Lynne asked her if she wanted to see her Shih Tzu puppy, Precious, to which Victoria gleefully said yes and walked away with her. About 300 meters away in a retirement residence parking lot, they got inside Michael Rafferty's car. Hitting the highway, they made sure that Victoria stayed crouched down in the seat, hidden away from any leering eyes. They made multiple stops along the way. First at a Tim Hortons, a Canadian coffee house and fast food restaurant, where Terri-Lynne purchased a tea. They drove about an hour away from Woodstock, where Michael Rafferty stopped at a person's house and bought Percocet pills. Then they headed off to a gas station, where he went inside and used an ATM. The last stop was at a Home Depot, but this time, Terri-Lynne was the one who went in, leaving the girl alone with Michael. Terri-Lynne McClintic had been instructed to purchase a claw hammer and a box of garbage bags. In tears, she admitted to the detective how she hesitated going back to the car, but she knew that if she was at least there, she could make the situation somewhat better for Victoria. The interrogation video shows the officer leaving to grab a box of tissues. Terri-Lynne McClintic's flowing tears instantly turn off as if there was a switch, and she appears calm and relaxed, casually sipping on her drink. When the detective returns, so do her overwhelming emotions. Experienced and highly skilled interrogator, Detective Sergeant Jim Smythe, played along with her little game. He used his brilliant skills to lure her into feeling she could tell him the truth, and that he believed her version of events. Detective Smythe said to Terri-Lynne, "I know you didn't want to see it, but you were there, so we need to know what happened to Tori." She described how Michael drove off the highway several miles down to an isolated farmer's field, and how he had parked brazenly within the view of a house. At one point, Michael even asked her if she thought someone could see him. Terri-Lynne McClintic told the officer that she didn't want to see what he was going to do to Victoria, so she went for a walk. When she returned a few minutes later, she saw that Michael was now in the back seat with the girl. The sight of this really upset Terri-Lynne. She didn't want to be there, so she walked away from the vehicle again. Sobbing to the investigator, Terri-Lynne claims that she turned her head away and that she could hear the little girl calling her name, saying to her, "T, make 'em stop." Once more, Detective Smythe played good cop with the suspect and calmly said to her, "We need you to tear the bandage off and tell us what you saw." According to Terri-Lynne McClintic, Michael Rafferty kicked Victoria a couple of times. Then he placed the garbage bag over her head. Using the claw hammer, he struck the girl in the head multiple times until she stopped moving. Terri-Lynne then made a weird, disturbing statement to Sergeant Smythe about how Michael knew what he was doing with those garbage bags because it made the whole thing easier, leaving no blood spatter. According to Terri-Lynne, Michael then placed the claw hammer and some of their clothes into a garbage bag and drove away. She never saw Victoria again. They went to a convenience store where he washed up and discarded the bag of evidence. Next, they ran the vehicle through a car wash, cleaning and shampooing the interior before returning to town. Detective Sergeant Jim Smythe thanked Terri-Lynne McClintic for telling the truth. He commended her for being brave, but that they still needed that one last piece of the puzzle. They need to bring Victoria Stafford home. Terri-Lynne told him that that's why she was there, to tell the police everything. She described how Michael Rafferty had placed the dead girl in garbage bags and laid her under a large tree, putting several rocks over her remains. During the police interview, she declined having an attorney present 4 times. 18-year-old Terri-Lynne McClintic was charged with abduction and aiding in the murder of 8-year-old Victoria Stafford. The young woman's detailed confession secured the arrest of 28-year-old Michael Rafferty that same night. He was charged with kidnapping, sexual assault, causing bodily harm, and first-degree murder. Within an hour of his arrest, the police presented him with Terri-Lynne's signed confession. The investigators then laid out a picture of exactly what happened to the girl that day. Unlike Terri-Lynne McClintic, Michael Rafferty swore he didn't do anything. He is seen visibly shaken, half covered by a police blanket, cowering in the corner, his eyes lowered to the ground. With Terri-Lynne McClintic's assistance, including a map she had drawn for officers, the Ontario Provincial Police retraced the couple's steps to the crime scene, but nothing was found where she claimed the girl's body was. However, phone records surfaced indicating that Michael Rafferty's cell phone had pinged near a tower by Mount Forest, Ontario. On Sunday, July 19, 2009, the same detective who coaxed a confession out of Terri-Lynne and played bad cop with Michael suddenly exited the highway while driving back from OPP headquarters. His instincts told him Victoria was nearby. Detective Sergeant Smythe drove down a country road east of Mount Forest and began to explore the fields. There he found a spot that looked eerily similar to what Terri-Lynne McClintic had described. And there, underneath a large tree, he discovered the little girl's body. She had been wrapped inside garbage bags, buried under a pile of rocks. Her remains had been there for months, so they were in an advanced state of decomposition and had begun to skeletonize. The autopsy would show that the girl had died from blunt force trauma to her head and body. The medical examiner's report revealed that she had a lacerated liver, fractured ribs, and skull fractures. One of her mother's butterfly earrings, which she had returned to the classroom for on the day she was taken, was still on her. The earring, along with her body and dental records, would confirm the remains to be 8-year-old Victoria Stafford. Rodney Stafford and his son Darren were at the beach collecting glass on the day he received the call that 2 people were in custody. Officers informed him that there had been some new developments in the case, and they needed to speak to him right away. As he drove back to his house, his heart was filled with joy, believing that his little girl had been safely found. Then the police told him they had arrested 2 individuals for Victoria's murder. His heart sank. Rodney Stafford was in disbelief. Until they found her remains, her father stayed in denial that she was really gone. There was a part of him that held on to hope that the stories just weren't true, and that somehow she would be found alive. His last remnants of hope were destroyed when he was told the devastating news that her body had been located. It wasn't any different for her mother, Tara. She had believed that the police had come to tell her Victoria was alive. When they found her body, the horror of the reality of it all was too much to cope with, and she soon turned back to using opioids, in her words, to be able to function at all. The words her 11-year-old brother Darren spoke during a public memorial held were heartbreaking. He spoke of how he missed seeing his little sister every night before bed, and that, as your big brother, I was supposed to protect you, but I guess I didn't. The family then held a private funeral to say goodbye. On April 30th, 2010, Terri-Lynne McClintic pled guilty to first-degree murder and avoided a trial. She received a life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Her confession was placed under a strict publication ban to prevent the tainting of the jury, and thus the trial of Michael Rafferty from being jeopardized. Ontario Superior Court Justice Dougald McDermott extended the publication ban on her plea and confession for several more months. The media grew frustrated and claimed that it was far too reaching, but its purpose to clearly prevent a miscarriage of justice was worth it. In December 2010, the ban was partially lifted, revealing how Terri-Lynne McClintic had pleaded guilty months earlier. On February 7, 2011, Michael Rafferty's defense attorney, Dirk Durstein, requested a change of venue due to the massive publicity around the case. Ontario Superior Justice Thomas Heaney approved the request and moved Rafferty's trial to London, Ontario. But it still wasn't far enough away to avoid the huge crowds of enraged citizens. Justice Heaney also ruled that, considering the hatred and hostility toward the defendant, Michael Rafferty would remain sitting in the prisoner's dock throughout the trial due to concerns of security. It was also decided that the jury would visit the location where Victoria Stafford's remains were discovered. I found this particularly interesting because I've never heard of this tactic being used in a murder trial. To me, it seems such a move is overly biased and prejudicial to the defense's case to have jury members visit the site where a child was killed. I am surprised that such an approach by the prosecution was permitted. After his formal arraignment, Michael Rafferty entered a plea of not guilty on February 29, 2011, to charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. On March 5, 2011, his murder trial began. A jury of 9 women and 3 men would determine the fate of the man accused of kidnapping, raping, and murdering an 8-year-old girl. According to Victoria Stafford's family members, Michael Rafferty showed no respect in the courtroom, and he never expressed any remorse. He was arrogant and smug, and according to Victoria's maternal grandmother, he'd smirk at her in the courtroom. Over 6 excruciatingly long days, the family listened to every gut-wrenching and repulsive detail of what happened to 8-year-old Victoria Stafford. The only time her father, Rodney, left the trial was when the state presented graphic images of his dead little girl to the jury. In his words, each moment he had to listen to the horror of what she endured, the rage and hatred inside him continued to build. For her mother, Terri McDonald, it was as simple as Victoria was the one who had to suffer. So the least she could do for her daughter was listen to what she had been put through. Terri McDonald testified in court to having crossed paths with Terri-Lynne McClintic when she bought drugs from her mother's house. She confessed that she was a drug addict and had used OxyContin the day her daughter disappeared. Upon cross-examination, Terri McDonald stressed that there was no way that Victoria would have left with a stranger. Now, 2 things stand out about this statement that don't add up. First, she claimed that Terri-Lynne and Victoria had never met, and that she never even mentioned her. If that's true, then why would she say that she wouldn't have left with someone she didn't know? Is it possible that she brought her daughter over to Terri-Lynne's mother's house to purchase drugs but never told anyone about it or even forgot? How else would Terri-Lynne have been familiar enough with Victoria to get the girl to leave with her? There has also been speculation, although never proven, that Victoria Stafford was not a random girl taken that day, but that Terri-Lynne had specifically selected her as their victim. Terri-Lynne McClintic was the state's star witness in the trial of Michael Rafferty. She described how she had met him in February 2009 at a pizza parlor. They went for a drive in his car and had sex. Terri-Lynne claimed that Michael Rafferty was someone she really cared about. But from what is known, their relationship appeared to be little more than having sex with each other a couple of times and her buying him some OxyContin from her mother. Based on the evil acts they committed together, it seemed the real purpose of their getting together was to fulfill their twisted, sick desires to hurt someone. Terri-Lynne McClintic had confessed and pleaded guilty to being a participant in the girl's abduction and aiding in her subsequent rape and murder, but had sworn that it was Michael Rafferty who had killed Victoria Stafford. During his criminal trial, she changed her story. Now she claimed that Michael Rafferty had raped the girl, but she alone used the claw hammer that killed her. On the stand, she told the shocked and appalled courtroom, "It was me that committed the murder and not him. He didn't physically kill her. It wasn't him that killed her. It was me." She had confessed to a counselor in jail a few weeks before the trial and went to the police with an official statement the following day. On the second day in court, Terri-Lynne McClintic told the courtroom that the plan was if the investigation led to her, she would take the fall for the murder. But she reiterated that she was the only one who swung the hammer that killed Victoria Stafford. When the jury was shown the police interview where she said there was no way in hell that she was the woman on surveillance footage who kidnapped Victoria, Terri-Lynne replied that at the time she had psychologically blocked out her involvement in the crime. Now, it was the defense's chance to paint a story of how Terri-Lynne McClintic had hand-picked Victoria Stafford, and it was she alone who had orchestrated the entire crime. The defense counsel presented a scenario that portrayed Michael Rafferty as innocent of the crimes for which he had been accused. According to his attorney, he was merely a spectator who was shocked and horrified by Terri-Lynne's depraved plan to kidnap and kill Victoria over a drug debt her mother Tara owed. When she brought him to the girl as a sexual offering, Michael Rafferty didn't want anything to do with it, and he claims he never touched her. But the evidence against Michael Rafferty told a different story. During the search of his residence, investigators found a missing child poster of Victoria Stafford tucked inside a kitchen drawer. When his vehicle was searched after he was arrested in May of 2009, officers noticed that the back seat was gone. Several people testified to it being there in the months before her death. Crime scene analysts discovered a mixture of blood on the rubber molding on the back passenger side door of his vehicle. When the blood was tested and examined, the DNA matched that of 8-year-old Victoria Stafford. His poor moral character was also testified to by many in his life. Several of his former girlfriends claimed Michael Rafferty was a serial cheater. It was learned through the testimony of an ex-girlfriend, Charity Spitzig, a 26-year-old mother of 4, that Rafferty had manipulated her into being an escort and primarily lived off of her earnings. Beginning at the end of 2000 and through May 2009, bank records showed that she had given him over $16,000. Michael Rafferty was a narcissist, a manipulator, a user, and a drug addict. Not only did he come off as a despicable person, but there was strong evidence that proved that not only was he there during each step of the atrocious crimes committed against Victoria Stafford, but he was a pedophile, a child kidnapper, a rapist, and a murderer. Michael Rafferty never took the stand in his own defense. Over 2 months of testimony, 200 pieces of evidence, and almost 60 witnesses were presented by the Crown. The fate of this child predator was now left in the hands of the jury. The public learned, while the jury was deliberating, that according to released court documents, which had been suppressed as evidence due to its improper search and seizure by the police, Michael Rafferty's computer contents showed his true, vile nature. He had searched for and downloaded a film containing child torture and rape. On May 11, 2012, after an entire day of deliberations, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. 4 days later, Michael Rafferty faced the judge and Victoria Stafford's family, who shared victim impact statements. The letter written by her now 14-year-old brother, Darren, left few eyes dry in the courtroom. Read by the family's lawyer, it said, and I quote, "Not one person can say they feel the same way as me. My sister was the only person I had to talk to. Someone that felt what I felt. Cried when I cried. Laughed when I laughed. And now I feel alone. Like the world is playing a sick trick on me. But it's not. This is my reality. No more fun times. Just old memories. No more I love you. Just an empty spot in my heart." It was observed that the convicted offender himself sobbed during these statements. Whether his tears were of a place of sincere remorse and regret, or an expression of his narcissistic manipulations, I couldn't say. Before Judge Thomas Heaney handed him his punishment, he turned and said to Michael Rafferty, "You have snuffed out the life of a beautiful, talented, vivacious little girl, a tomboy diva in the trustful innocence of childhood. And for what? So that you could gratify your twisted and deviant desire to have sex with a child? Only a monster could commit such an act of pure evil. You, sir, are a monster." Michael Rafferty was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for at least 25 years. He received 10 additional years for sexual assault that caused bodily harm and kidnapping. They are to be served concurrently. When the sentencing was announced, Rodney Stafford had to hold in his screams of celebration, his cries of justice for his little girl. But when he fled to the media waiting outside, he didn't hold back his happiness for Victoria. Holding a picture of his daughter, Rodney declared, "We got justice, and it was all for this little girl right here." Victoria Stafford was described as being both a tomboy and a little princess, as the judge referred to her as a tomboy diva. She loved reptiles, dogs, and running around in the dirt. But she also loved the color pink, wearing barrettes in her hair, and makeup. Victoria was silly, rambunctious, and stubborn. Her mother called her Chub Chubs. One of Victoria's neighbors, Vince, spoke of how one time Victoria ran over to his house to show him a snake she found. She wanted his help in catching it. He had her name tattooed across his knuckles in her memory. The entire community deeply felt the loss and shared in the family's trauma. But everyone deals with loss and trauma in their own way. In August of that year, Ronnie Stafford and his son Darren honored Victoria's memory by completing a 3,500-kilometer charity bike ride from Woodstock to Edmonton. Her father is an advocate for victims of crime and is constantly fighting to help transform the correction system in his daughter's name. He has built an online and in-person community that invites all victims and their loved ones to support one another, share their experiences, and fight together to change the system. Her mother, Terri McDonald, was utterly consumed by the loss of her daughter. She was unable and unwilling to advocate like Rodney was. She openly admitted to not being strong like Victoria's father, and that she continues to struggle with her addiction. In an interview with Crime Beat, she proudly shows off a large tattoo on her shoulder of her late daughter. A dog is curled up next to her. She said that it helps her remember the good times with Victoria, who loved dogs and all animals so much, and to live her life the best she can. If this case had occurred in the United States or another country that supports capital punishment, the prosecutor would have likely and understandably pursued the death penalty. To understand how and why these two depraved, twisted child predators and killers received such lenient sentences, knowing the foundation and understanding the purpose of Canada's correction system is critical. Canada abolished the death penalty on December 10, 1998. Ever since its abolishment, the maximum sentence an offender can receive is called life 25, which is life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for a set period of 25 years. Data shows that on average, those who receive a life sentence serve 32 years before being released. Canada is based on a rehabilitation model of justice. In stark contrast, the United States is a crime control model centered around punishment and deterrence. Offenders who receive penalties that include time in prison are very rare in Canada. For most first-time offenders, unless they commit capital offenses or other serious crimes, they are never incarcerated. It is not unusual for some offenders to receive 4, even 5 terms of probation before they are handed a prison sentence. The primary goal of the correction system in Canada is offenders' reintegration into society through the principles of guidance, training, and supervision. Some inmates who receive 90 days or less in prison have the option to serve their time on the weekends, being able to carry on with life as normal during the week. Federal and provincial inmates who have completed 1/6 of their sentence have the possibility of being released on day parole or full parole. For those in the federal system, the mandatory release program releases convicted offenders who have completed at least 2/3 of their sentence and who have exhibited good behavior back into the community. There they remain under correctional authority, similar to parole conditions, until their sentence expires. However, although they are accountable to what equates to a parole officer, they aren't on parole, since there isn't a designated board that has made decisions regarding their status. Instead, parole officers serve as a resource and support inmates in housing and employment and help them successfully reintegrate into society. It was expected that Terri-Lynne McClintic would serve out her sentence without any further burden or trauma being inflicted on Victoria Stafford's loved ones. Unfortunately, this was not the case. Canada is centered around prisoner rehabilitation, and their correction system reflects this priority. In 2018, Terri-Lynne McClintic was moved from a high-security prison to the Okama-Ochi Healing Lodge in Saskatchewan. This was shocking for multiple reasons. First, because of the violent nature of her crimes, especially against a child. This wasn't a typical offender who would have been admitted. Secondly, she had been involved in a violent physical altercation against a fellow inmate. McClintic had initiated a peer support meeting with a fellow inmate, Amy McIntyre, who was also in prison on a first-degree murder conviction. Once they were inside the meeting room, McClintic, completely unprovoked, began to attack Amy McIntyre, punching her in the head. The woman fell off her chair onto the floor and was lying in a fetal position while Terri-Lynne repeatedly kicked her in the body and head. She didn't do anything to fight back. The only remorse Terri-Lynne McClintic expressed was that she wished the room had been larger so she could have caused the woman even more damage. The incident was eerily similar to how she had attacked Victoria Stafford. Terri-Lynne McClintic had admitted to police how she was the one who had kicked the child while she lay on the ground in the fetal position before whacking her to death with the claw hammer. After the attack on Amy McIntyre, her privileges were revoked for 2 months and she was segregated in the prison for an additional month. The judge sentenced her to 6 months in jail to be served concurrently with her life sentence. This was Terri-Lynne McClintic's 10th assault offense. How does this kind of violence warrant being downgraded as a lesser security risk? You may be wondering how something like this could happen. In 2014, for some undocumented and unjustified reason, Terri-Lynne McClintic was reclassified as a medium security risk, providing her with the opportunity to stay at the Indigenous Healing Lodge. The third reason her admission to the Indigenous Healing Lodge was so unusual was that she wasn't Indigenous. Indigenous healing lodges were established in Canada's correction system in 1995, specifically for female Indigenous offenders, so that they had a place of rehabilitation that was more aligned with their culture and beliefs. The practices, culture, and values of the Nakanee tribe are taught to the women. While housed there, the female inmates are taught about self-empowerment. They learn about the importance of making meaningful and responsible choices in life, and to show respect and dignity for both themselves and others. It is designed to be a nurturing atmosphere for the women, one of support and shared responsibility. There is a loophole for someone who is non-Indigenous under prisoners' charter rights. Anyone can self-identify as Indigenous and thus be allowed entry. According to the Aboriginal Initiatives Directorate, CSC Marty Maltby, if someone who was non-Indigenous but who sincerely identifies as being so, then the denial of their entry into an Indigenous healing lodge would violate their charter rights. However, then Chief of the Nakanee First Nation, Alvin Francis, acknowledged that it was shocking that Terri-Lynne McClintic had been placed there, given the depraved nature of her crimes. When Ronnie Stafford was informed of this news, he was outraged by the system's failure. He refused to remain quiet when this woman, who had brutally murdered his little girl, was now living at a lower security place to help heal her. He and his family coordinated protests on Parliament Hill where hundreds were in attendance. Ronnie Stafford met with the Commissioner of Correctional Services and the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau himself, to discuss the injustice of the circumstances and their impact on his family. During a hearing with Parliament addressing the matter, when an opposing leader described in detail what the offender under consideration had done, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stated to the leaders that it was not warranted, it was not needed to include such graphic, violent details in the discussion. This was a reflection of the government and the correction system's focus on helping prisoners over the victims. And the conservative leaders in Parliament and most of the country had had enough. In an interview with Crimebeat, Terri-Lynne's adoptive brother, his identity concealed, said that he wishes he could be out there to protest with the crowds because she should remain in prison and not an Indigenous healing lodge. Less than a week later, the Minister of Public Safety decided to take a closer look at the circumstances surrounding the inmate's transfer. He stated that he would follow the rules of the law, and if any changes needed to be made, the family would be promptly informed. Rodney Stafford was contacted by Corrections Canada not long after. They let him know that his daughter's killer had been returned to where she belonged. Not only that, but this transgression in judgment fundamentally altered the way offenders would be transferred to the healing lodges in the future, including an in-depth evaluation of their sentence length, behavior, and consultations with the local Indigenous community. Based on the rehabilitation-centered correction system in Canada, if Rodney Stafford and the community hadn't spoken out against the placement of Terri-Lynne McClintic at the Healing Lodge, she very well could have been on her way to reintegration in the community. There are many examples of violent offenders, including mass murderers, whom, due to good behavior and participation in prison, end up receiving day passes and eventually are released to live amongst the community. After he was sentenced, Michael Rafferty immediately started the process of appeal, claiming the jury didn't understand the standards of evidence required to meet a first-degree murder conviction. On December 13, 2013, his lawyer argued that the jury should have taken into consideration that he was an accessory after the fact to murder and had not committed the homicide. Michael Rafferty even attempted to receive public money to fund his appeal. Only a few months after the battle to return Terri-Lynne McClintic to prison, Rodney Stafford learned that Michael Rafferty had been transferred to a lower security prison in Quebec. The justification was made that it specialized in the rehabilitation of sex offenders. The Minister of Public Safety, Ralph Goodale, further justified his placement there by stating that it was a fully guarded institution, with his presence there posing no threat to public safety. One of Michael Rafferty's relatives, who has chosen to remain anonymous, came forward to prevent him from being moved to medium security. Rodney Stafford had gained an unexpected ally. He visited Michael Rafferty several times while incarcerated, encouraging him to admit the truth and to stop using his mother. His mother, Deborah Rafferty, staunchly supported her son, telling the media at the courthouse that her son was innocent and that this could happen to any man walking around right now. But the truth was that while in prison, Michael Rafferty had been using his lifelong skills of manipulation to drain his mother of over $30,000. Starting when he was placed in maximum security prison, he called her saying that he was in the infirmary and needed money for protection. Then, regularly, he got his mother to send checks to the wives and family members of other inmates, claiming it was to save his life. Reporters from Global Canada made contact with several of the individuals on the checks that were paid, but no one corroborated his relatives' claims. They also contacted Michael Rafferty, but he declined to comment. His relative believed that the money may have been initially for his protection, but once he was inside medium security, it was all for favors. He completely drained his mother of all of her savings, and she ended up losing her house. In 2018, Deborah Rafferty died at age 60. Her mother then was faced with the burden of Michael Rafferty begging her for money, and she died shortly after. This relative, along with other members of Michael Rafferty's family, wrote the Corrections Services of Canada and provided them with documented proof to help warrant a reason as to why he should be returned to maximum security. For more than a year and a half, they corresponded with the relatives, but they never closely looked into the matter at all. The concerns about Michael Rafferty were ultimately ignored and dismissed, and he remained in the medium security prison. Rodney Stafford spoke of how he sincerely appreciated the efforts they made to make things right, even if Corrections Canada ultimately failed. What was surprising to learn is that Tara McDonald ended up meeting with Michael Rafferty. Victim offender therapy, also known as mediation, is a restorative form of justice, a process where the offender and the victim are given the opportunity, with a neutral facilitator, to discuss the crime and its impact. It is a widely used process in Canada as well as the United States. Usually reserved for less violent crimes, it has been utilized as a tool for restoration in a wide range of crimes, including offenders on death row in the United States. Research has shown that it can be highly beneficial in the healing process for victims and promote accountability on the part of the offender. When Michael Rafferty was sentenced, he spoke directly to Tara McDonald in the courtroom, saying that if she wanted to know about her daughter's final moments, she should talk to him. He delivered what he promised. Tara McDonald didn't want to hear that she was terrified or what he did to her, but how Victoria was, how she acted, what she did from the moment Terri-Lynne had lured her away up to when they drove her to the farmer's field. Tara McDonald shared in an interview with Crime Beat that while Terri-Lynne McClintic was inside the Home Depot and Michael was alone with Victoria in the car, he offered her his smartphone to play on. When asked if she knew how to use one, she replied, "Yeah, I'm 8. Tara McDonald openly laughed and said, "Yeah, that's my Victoria, all right." It was odd and a bit unsettling that she shared this moment with her daughter's monster. This was the one thing that transpired between the mother and her daughter's offender that Tara McDonald was willing to talk about. She said that in some ways it was helpful, even though Michael Rafferty was partially responsible for the horror Victoria endured. She has never spoken about, nor will she ever reveal exactly what he shared with her. Interestingly, but understandably, she holds more hatred and resentment toward Terri-Lynne McClintic, and when she requested the same type of mediation with her, Tara McDonald refused. I think to some extent Tara McDonald was more horrified and angry by what Terri-Lynne McClintic did to her daughter than Michael Rafferty, because she was a woman. A young woman who helped plot and orchestrate the kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder of a child. Similar to other violent female offenders who have committed crimes against children, Terri-Lynne McClintic is a highly unusual criminal. If you haven't already listened to episode 61, The Devil Monster of France, and episodes 56 and 57, A Female Thrill Killer, please do so. They are very fascinating and disturbing cases that are pertinent to the discussion of this kind of very rare female offender. Similar to data in the United States, United Kingdom, France, and most parts of the Western world, female offenders in Canada are the exception to the rule. Approximately 5.8% of all prisoners in Canada are female, and the Indigenous population incarcerated is overrepresented. This was the primary reason why the Indigenous healing lodges were established. In 2023, a total of 518 males and 78 females were charged with homicide. Between 2000 and 2023, female offenders committed homicide at a low rate of 53 incidents in 2008 to peak years of 2020 and 2022 with 105 incidents. For female offenders, the majority are familial, that is, they occur within the family, and 88% of the time, the crime scene is in their home. Male-perpetuated homicides were at a low of 428 incidents in 2014, and were also at a high in 2022 with 719. Interestingly, the percentage of strangers murdering strangers is significantly higher in Canada than in the United States. Research shows that between 18 to 19% of all solved homicides in Canada involve a stranger perpetrator. Stranger victimization occurred in 21.1% of male homicides and 11.3% of female homicides. A study done on sexual homicide in Canada revealed that across a sample of 350 sexual homicide cases, characteristics of the offenders surfaced that mirrored similar studies in Canada and in different countries. The average age of the offender was 28. Most of them were white and had diverse criminal records, meaning a combination of charges in their past, specifically an average of 1.7 convictions for violent offenses, 0.4 convictions for sexual offenses, and 7.3 for property-related crimes. 62.8% of the victims were identified as being white female, with more than a third of them having drug abuse issues and a fourth with alcohol abuse issues. When children are the victims of abduction, the data shows that 84% are female. On average, the victims are between 11 and 12 years old. The offenders are overwhelmingly male, with 92% recorded as identifying as such. 69% were under 30 years old, and 55% had a criminal history. The primary motivation of child abduction is sexual, with 77% of recorded incidents involving a convicted offender. Almost half of all abductions happen in the summer months, with 45% occurring on a Friday or a Saturday. The majority were kidnapped in transit, such as on their way to school or a friend's house, and 70% of children who were murdered were killed within 3 hours of being taken. From the perspective of criminology and psychology, there is much to unwind regarding the factors and motivations of Terri-Lynne McClintic. In no way does her background and trauma provide her with a valid reason for committing the worst crimes imaginable. But it is critical to know her story, her life experience, so that the warning signs aren't ignored, and similar crimes can hopefully be prevented. It is necessary to peel back and look closely at the layers of darkness that helped turn this young woman into the monster she became. Most individuals are not born evil. They are filled with rage, darkness, and a dark hole of depravity that can only be temporarily filled by making others, and particularly the innocent, suffer. Nonconformist perspectives suggest that without social controls, rules, and restrictions, humans would commit crimes without any regard for how their actions affect others. From this perspective, Travis Hershey's social control theory was developed. Social control theory is a popular theory in criminology that suggests our social bonds dictate our behavior and can help hinder bad, immoral behavior or exacerbate it. It posits that humans who have weak or no connections with society or positive attachments to others have a higher propensity to non-conform to society's expectations and rules, and therefore are more likely to commit crimes. These connections or bonds are derived from various sources throughout one's life, beginning in childhood with parental and sibling bonds. It involves 4 primary elements: attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief. Bonds can be formed at school, church, or through extracurricular activities shared with peers. The time and investment involved in creating and maintaining them can remove or minimize desires to act out in antisocial, deviant, or nonconforming manners. A large body of research has shown a strong correlation between the two. From the day Terri-Lynne McClintic was born, her life was one of abandonment, neglect, abuse, and trauma. Her mother gave her away to a fellow stripper friend of hers named Carol McClintic. There was no semblance of stability, kindness, or love in Terri-Lynne's life. Carol McClintic was a drug addict and moved to a new area of Ontario every couple of years. At 7 years old, Terri-Lynne was placed into Children's Aid Societies, Ontario's foster care system, and later at several detention centers. This pattern continued into her teens before she returned to live with Carol McClintic. Studies show that one of the most reliable predictors of juvenile delinquency is a weak bond between a child and their parents. Terri-Lynne McClintic attended many different schools and had few friends. Kids at school made fun of her and bullied her for being the daughter of a stripper. At 8 years old, she first started drinking alcohol and smoking marijuana, which later escalated into using OxyContin, ecstasy, morphine, and antidepressants. Terri-Lynne didn't hide what she was going through and how destructive and violent her mindset was, even as a child. At some point, she put her dog in a microwave. Through letters and in her journal, she shared her violent fantasies. She was sexually and physically abused by men who walked in and out of her mother's life. At 13 years old, she dropped out of school altogether. Terri-Lynne McClintic lacked any positive attachments or connections to society. She was uneducated, didn't work, lacked any goals, and had no dreams to attain. Studies show that when someone, especially a child, is in an environment that is high stress, such as being in an abusive home, it can lead to substance abuse, personality disorders, intimate partner violence, and delays in cognitive development. An individual's biological, psychological, and neurological functioning can be adversely and sometimes severely affected by these environmental conditions. Terri-Lynne McClintic had no one in her life to model herself after. She was exposed to nothing but abuse, addiction, and violence from her earliest years. There was no one to teach her proper emotions, reactions, or behaviors. She had no coping skills, no positive outlet for her pain and anger, nothing and no one to help guide her. The data shows that adolescents who commit crimes between the ages of 7 and 12 are 2 to 3 times more likely to become chronic violent offenders than those who commit their first crimes at an older age. For Terri-Lynne, it was only a matter of time and circumstance before she committed murder. Her criminality began to reveal itself at 10 years old. She was caught stealing from a hardware store. At 15, she fractured her adoptive mother's cheekbone by punching her in the face. She had 4 more charges of assault brought against her after this incident. One of the incidents occurred when she was staying at a youth residence center, and 3 additional assaults happened at a detention center. 2 years before she killed Victoria Stafford, she mugged 2 men, and during the incident, stabbed one of them in the back. While being arrested, she struck the police officer in the back of the head. During Michael Rafferty's trial, his defense lawyer cross-examined Terri-Lynne McClintic. He presented a series of letters she had written to a friend from jail between September 2007 and only a few months before she lured Victoria Stafford to her death. The letters explicitly expressed the desire to kill, to murder, and torture others, including specific individuals who had planned on testifying against her in court for prior charges, and others who were mouthing off in jail. Terri-Lynne McClintic had never hidden her rage or her darkness, her clear intent to harm others. Less than a year before she killed Victoria Stafford, she had written a letter describing her desire to take the first person I see and kill them. She was sent to a medical professional after this letter was seen. In another letter she wrote, "I am fed up with this place. I want to scrap. I just want to bounce and go on a killing spree." Her letters were not simply violent and graphic. She discussed multiple ways in which she would torture those she viewed as her enemies. It was noted that when these letters were read during Michael Rafferty's trial, several people in the courtroom grew visibly uncomfortable. According to Terri-Lynne McClintic, she had adopted a gang mentality and persona while in jail, but she had written those letters when she was much younger. This statement didn't hold any weight since some of the letters were written only a few months before she murdered Victoria Stafford. It should be noted that Michael Rafferty also didn't have a stable upbringing. For unknown reasons, he was sent to live with his aunt and uncle when he was an adolescent, most likely indicating his shared lack of attachment to society. Like Terri-Lynne McClintic, he was also a drug addict, and according to 13 women who testified at his trial, a sadist who really enjoyed choking them during sex. His anger, deviance, and antisocial behavior manifested themselves in aggressive and sexually violent ways. When McClintic and Rafferty met, their deviant, antisocial, non-conforming behaviors, combined with their violent, twisted fantasies, created a strong, toxic bond that culminated in the abduction, rape, and murder of a child. This case is horrific, tragic, disgusting, and may have been completely preventable if it weren't for Canada's Children's Aid Services failing Terri-Lynne McClintic when she was the same age Victoria Stafford was murdered. This is not to express empathy for Terri-Lynne McClintic as a child murderer, a sick, depraved young woman who led a child to an unspeakable assault and death, but for the innocent child who existed once within Terri-Lynne, who warranted and deserved to be protected. The system failed this child when she needed them the most, even though they had been made aware of the danger she was in multiple times. Victoria Stafford's death changed the requirements of the Amber Alert system in Canada, which has undoubtedly led to many children's lives being saved. The strict, narrow requirements are now to be used as guidelines, and the police only need to have suspicion that the child's life is in danger to issue an alert. Her murder and the subsequent treatment of her killers has exposed critical faults in the Canadian correction system. Before this case and the public outrage and protest that followed Terri-Lynne McClintic's transfer to an Indigenous healing lodge, the Correctional Service of Canada was not mandated to inform victims or their families about an offender being transferred or when their security status changed. This act has since been amended, making it mandatory for victims of specific offenses to be notified of such changes. It provides victims with relevant information on the offender and the opportunity to have a voice in such matters. Also, due to the horrific graphic evidence that was presented during the trial of Michael Rafferty, which led to a juror suing the government for trauma and psychological harm it caused them, there is now a counseling service to address the after effects of serving on juries. The way prisoners' lives have been prioritized over the victims and their families have poked serious holes in proponents' arguments for prisoners' rehabilitation. When it comes to the criminal justice system in the United States, I tend to think we are overly harsh in our penalties and do little to nothing to help convicted offenders heal from the traumas and conditions that may have led them to committing crimes, much less provide them with the resources necessary to successfully reenter society. I believe that prisoners should have basic fundamental rights and that the factors that led them to commit crimes, such as substance abuse, mental health, and trauma, should be addressed and treated while incarcerated. However, the rights of an offender should never take precedence over that of the victim and their family. Canada is the polar opposite of the United States in its corrections and justice model, and there are many positive aspects to its focus being on rehabilitation. However, there has to be a balance between the needs of inmates and victims. Individuals who are the worst of violent offenders, in particular serial rapists, mass murderers, and anyone who harms a child, should be exempt from these programs and services. They are not worth the time and effort, not to mention Canadian taxpayer money it takes to rehabilitate them. The Faint Hope Clause in Canada was passed to promote prisoners' rehabilitation. This allowed Terri-Lynne McClintic to apply for parole only 15 years into her sentence. In large part due to the heinous crimes she committed, the clause was repealed in 2012. In a horrible and shocking update on this case, in 2024, Corrections Canada relocated her to a nice, comfortable townhouse in the same facility of a mother and child program. That's right, justice for Victoria Stafford and her loved ones still doesn't exist. This monster, this child predator and murderer, is residing in a nicer home than most of us have on the Canadian taxpayer with open access to children. Maybe she herself wasn't a child sex offender, but that doesn't change the fact that she kidnapped and brought an 8-year-old girl to one. Not to mention how she bashed in her head with a claw hammer. Terri-Lynne McClintic will be eligible for parole on May 19th, 2031, and I have little doubt that she will receive it. Thank you so much for listening to the tragic, horrible story of Victoria Tori Stafford. May she rest in peace. If you have any thoughts, questions, comments, ideas for future episodes, I would love to hear from you. Please reach out. You can find my contact information in the episode description. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets next door, especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Luda Caldwell. Original music Stranger, composed by Stereo Code.